nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Veni Sancti Spiritus repletuorum corda fidelium et tui amoris in eis signum accende, emite Spiritum tuum et creabuntur.
Et renovavis faciem Tebe.
Oremus Deus qui corda fidelium Sancti Spiritus ratione locoviste, et nobis in eorum Spiritu recta sapere, et de eius semper consolatione godere per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Sed esse sapientiae,
Ora pro nobis.
in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. All right, so we're going to finish up a few notes. Still left, a couple of things left on the Inquisition. We might come back to it later, but I'm just going to finish up what I was saying the other day, and then we'll go back to talking about Julius II, whom I believe we had not quite finished with before going on to the Inquisition. So for the last form of the Inquisition is the Roman Inquisition, called the Congregation of the Roman and Universal Inquisition, which was founded by Pope Paul III in 1542. And of course, this one is much more of an ecclesiastical institution, an ecclesiastical organization, as opposed to the Spanish Inquisition, which is a civil institution. It is a congregation of cardinals under the presidency of the Pope himself, organized to watch over the purity of the Catholic faith in matters of heresy, schism, or other crimes concerning religion, not only in the city of Rome, but in the entire Catholic world. Its jurisdiction extends over all the faithful, including the highest prelates, the cardinals alone being exempt. Its chief functions are the settling of religious controversies and the approbation or condemning of books concerning religious matters. Now we know it as the Holy Office. Of course, the Novus Ordo calls it the Congregation for the Defense of the Faith, or Doctrine of the Faith, something like that. CDF. So we jokingly refer to as Congregation for the Destruction of the Faith, which effectively functions as. But before Vatican II, it was always known as the Holy Office thing. And the full title also made reference to the Inquisition, but most commonly known as the Holy Office. And so that was the final note on that, and then we'll go back to Pope Julius II. And I think we still have a few pages of notes that I gave you last time. And is the printer working again? Okay. All right, I might start handing things out again, but not necessarily. We'll see how well this goes with you, rather having you take notes as I talk speaking from my own notes. If that doesn't work, if people are having too much trouble keeping up, or if there's any other difficulty, we can go back to handing out notes, but that's actually a bit of a pain to do that every single time. So anyway, if you still have it, page 26, the second paragraph up from the bottom, talking about Pope Julius II. This pontificate is of great importance in the history of art and architecture at Rome. So just finishing up Julius II. He made Bramante his architect-in-chief and planned a great extension of the Vatican by means of covered porticos and arcades. But Bramante's chief employment was to be the construction of a new basilica of St. Peter's. The old basilica and its contents were ripped away, and the foundations of the new St. Peter's laid on April 18th, 1506. Michelangelo was given the task, of erecting a sculptured chapel on the spot where he proposed to be buried, the Pope, that is. All these works were in varying degrees unfinished at the Pope's death. Two artistic developments of his pontificate were completed with Michelangelo's painting of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and Raphael's frescoes in the Pope's own apartments. Julius II deserves credit for the encouragement of the great artists of his day, but in his personal treatment of them, he was, so says our author, imperious and inconsiderate. He was aware of the abuse which existed in the Church, since in a constitution published in January 1513, he denounced the Seminary and declared that it invalidated the election of anyone tainted with it, even the Pope himself. Though he had engaged in such practices himself as a cardinal and they had tainted his own election, he had strongly disapproved of the morals and the behavior of Alexander VI, and may have realized that the moral deterioration of the Curia had gone too far. But the problems of his pontificate left no time for such reforming activities in any worthwhile scale. So he realized there were problems, wanted to fix them, but had too much else to deal with to bring about many solutions to those problems. And then moving on to page 27, Julius II clashed with Louis XII of France, whom he excommunicated, and against whom he formed a league. This was the signal for a new schism. The irritated monarch resolved to throw off the authority of the Pope. He assembled the French bishops, first at Orléans and afterwards at Tours, and proposed to them some questions which, according to the theories of Basel and Constance, led the prelates to the decision that the Pope should be warned and requested to convoke a general council, and that, in the event of his refusal, they should take the matter into their own hands. So we have here an application of conciliarism. In the following year, Louis forbade the French clergy to hold any communication whatever with the court of Rome, and took measures, in concert with the Emperor Maximilian, for the meeting of a general council. The convocation was made by 3 cardinals, one of whom was a Borgia, and the so-called council was opened at Pisa in 1511, with the attendance of 4 or 5 cardinals, several archbishops and bishops, with a number of doctors and jurists. The German clergy refused to take part in what was deemed, even in France, no better than a sacrilegious burlesque. After the first 3 sessions, the schismatic prelates, finding themselves unsafe amid the peasants, took refuge in Milan, where they were no better treated. They held 5 sessions there, then moved to Asti, and thence to Lyon, where the supposedly ecumenical council of Louis XII disappeared amid universal contempt and ridicule. So something of a flop. Just fell apart. They kept getting hostile receptions in various cities where they tried to set up, and then ended up just completely disintegrating. But in the meantime, Julius II had convoked an actual ecumenical council in Rome. The 17th General and 4th Lateran Council opened on the 3rd of May, 1512. It numbered more than 100 bishops, archbishops, and patriarchs, with a large number of doctors, heads of orders, and abbots. The Emperor Maximilian, King Henry VIII of England, the King of Aragon, and the Venetian Republic were represented by their ambassadors. The opening address given by the general of the Augustinians presented a lively picture of the woes which afflicted the church. With a vast field of labor open before them, the Lateran fathers began their labors. In the first 5 sessions, they condemned all the schismatic cardinals and the pseudo-council of Pisa. An anathema was launched against the pragmatic sanction, which the King of France had kept as a weapon to be used on occasion against the Holy See. Every election of an anti-pope was declared null. This decree, promulgated in the 5th session, was the last one signed by Julius II, who died on the 21st of February, 1513. At the time of his death, the Pope's policy was triumphant, at least his political policy. The French had been banished from Italy, and the tyrants banished from the cities they had so long oppressed. The political and military undertakings of his pontificate had not wholly absorbed the attention of Julius II. As we saw earlier, he resolved to rebuild the decaying Basilica of St. Peter and entrusted the gigantic design to Bramante. Indulgences were proclaimed in favor of those who should contribute toward the building, and on the 18th of April, 1506, the Pope laid the cornerstone in the presence of the cardinals and an immense multitude of people. Of course, we'll see those indulgences again. Well, those will come back. And of course, that's a legitimate thing in itself, to indulgences be granted to people who contribute to the building of a church, especially a huge church like St. Peter's. But we'll see how it caused trouble later on. Amid the bloody strife of the Italian princes, letters, and the arts began to feel an impulse, which was to be developed under Leo X. The medieval epoch was at an end. Its spirit was everywhere yielding to the study and imitation of pagan antiquity. So humanism was very much coming into its own. Perfection of form was becoming the only care of poets, painters, and sculptors. They were, little by little, breaking with the Christian traditions of the Middle Ages. They sought inspiration only in the models of antiquity. The destruction of the Basilica of St. Peter was the expression of this tendency. The impulse had been given. Pagan literature, brought to light by the fall of Constantinople, had opened the way for pagan art. Julius II was drawn along by the spirit of the age. And yes.
This is the end of our notes.
Yes. So now I'll continue on to try to follow along with note paper, if you have any. We now start with Pope Leo X, and this is going to be a very long one. Momentous pontificate, and not everywhere being a good way, of course. Reigned from March 11th, 1513 to December 1st, 1521. So 8 years, so fairly long for a pontificate of this era, but even so, a very busy 8 years. So the disorders, factions, and intrigues, which followed into the train of the Great Western Schism, had opened the way for revolt against the authority of the Church. Of course, if you've studied the Great Western Schism in any detail, that doesn't come as any surprise. When you have multiple claimants to the papacy, all claiming the allegiance of the entire Church, and all excommunicating all the followers of the other, it's no surprise that people are going to start taking papal authority even from an actual pope less seriously when you have so many years of that going on. So, now, the period upon which we are now entering witnessed in the rise of Lutheranism, the fiercest storm which had yet tried the strength of St. Peter's chair. Heresy was introduced in various parts of Christendom, became a powerful party in France, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Poland, and even the established religion of the state in England, Sweden, Denmark, and in several states of the empire. So yes, we'll have Henry VIII to deal with in the near future here. Its establishment was the signal for a fierce struggle between the Catholics and the so-called Reformers, which overturned the order of all Europe until the Treaty of Westphalia. And we'll see that in due time, what exactly that was. As we treat of the disturbances which ruined the peace of the world and compromised the future destinies of empires and of human society itself, out of the voice of a seditious Saxon monk, I think we know who that is, we shall take occasion to show that Protestantism was not the work of one man. Of course, Martin Luther was very much the catalyst for all of it, but he couldn't have done it had circumstances not been ripe for it. It owed its destructive power to the combined force of every hostile passion, of every evil instinct, of every element of hatred and cupidity. So we'll see it, but many, many factors came together. As is the case in every disaster, all the right elements lined up in just the right way for catastrophe to strike. The dogmatic question was a pretext, certainly on the part of civil rulers. They took advantage of this to throw off having to submit to the authority of the church, to giving revenues to the church, to the fact that the church held so much wealth in so many kingdoms. These were all things that they were rebelling against. Of course, taking advantage of the heretical ideas of Martin Luther to push their revolution. The dogmatic question, again, was made use of to mislead the multitude. Material interest was the true and only motive which led secular princes to throw off the authority of the church. But as we'll see, even those secular princes themselves started to suffer, we'll say, inconveniences from this heresy being propagated everywhere. There were not only did they themselves revolt against the authority of the church, but their own subjects began revolting against them, because really, where does it stop? Once you start that process, who's to say The right to revolution, as they saw it, stops here. Why does it not go any further? So it's natural that would happen, but that was what started the process. The world had reached a state in which the names of liberty and independence seemed to present to the overexcited imaginations new fields and boundless enjoyment. So throwing off all of their shackles as they saw it. Luther's doctrine of private inspiration and his principle of spiritual independence responded to the instincts of the 16th century. And as a result, his words exercised so great an influence, his blasphemies were so widely repeated, his insults so loudly applauded, his quarrels found so many soldiers, his proselytism so many neophytes, and his license so many imitators. So he said all of the right things that all the people at the time wanted to hear. So they joined him in revolution. From the very outset, Protestantism was broken up into fragments and sects, which again is not surprising when your operating system, as it were, is revolution. What's to prevent another one? So unity, which is strength, belongs to the Catholic Church alone, obviously. Luther would not recognize his own work as it exists at the present time. Yes, probably not what he had in mind, a different Protestant church in every street corner, practically. Protestantism stands as a political medium, certainly at the time when it started. As a religion, it is dead. Yes, when it keeps breaking up into smaller and smaller portions, clearly it was not a success in that regard. It never had, and of course never will have, never could have, say, Saint Francis Xavier, who would to subject empires to itself. Circumstances favoring its first steps. And it just so happens that the newly discovered invention of printing carried its anti-Catholic works by the thousands everywhere. So books becoming widely available, that means heresy becomes something accessible to everybody. Of course, not that heretics of past ages failed to find ways to infect the lesser educated. There were examples even of the Arians putting their heresies to popular tunes of the time. Of course, this was many centuries earlier, but essentially putting their heresies to songs so they could teach them to people maybe couldn't read, or of course couldn't afford books. Certainly books as they were at the time, definitely not. And they would teach them to essentially sing their heresies and then get them into their heads that way. So, and then the invention of gunpowder, which was around this time, by changing the ancient mode of warfare, furnished it with armies. So gunpowder becoming readily available makes it easy for these revolutionary armies. Well, they're really rabble, but we talked about the nations that went heretical. They had gunpowder to back up their heresy. But of course, in the midst of all these storms, the church was still expanding. So in other areas, because Christopher Columbus, having discovered the New World, there was a spiritual harvest in the Americas, which is estimated to have roughly corresponded to the number of people who defected from the faith in Europe. And of course, there were prodigies of holiness, fidelity, and devotedness for the scandals and disorders of Germany and England. So it wasn't all bad. We focus on all of the bad things, but there were some things that were actually good that were going on. The death of Julius II left the throne of St. Peter vacant. Catholic Europe had for her rulers in France, Louis XII, the one who called the Schismatic Council. In England, Henry VIII, the second king of the House of Tudor, of course, to become very famous for all of his crimes, who was to cover his name with the triple disgrace of apostasy, adultery, and barbarous cruelty, though his chivalric youth gave no presage of his future ignominy. In Germany, the Emperor Maximilian I ruled, who had shown himself the faithful ally of the Holy See, and who was soon to leave his crown to Charles V in Spain. or Emperor Charles V, who would become, of course, also King of Spain, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. But in the meantime, in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella were closing their career with prosper in their kingdom, and also in the practice of virtues. Let's see. I'll pass some of this. All right, so the conclave meeting met on the 4th of March in 1513, and the youngest among them, John de' Medici, one of those big Italian families we've seen. Well, I can't remember if we've seen recently Medici popes, but certainly we'll see them in the future, and that's just a very prominent family, the Medicis, who was 36 years of age, was appointed to collect the ballots. And then after a conclave of 7 days, so they were only in for a week, on the 11th of March, he read his own name on almost every single ballot. So, Leo X, he took the name. So entering on this dignity, he still has the 17th General Council going, Fourth Lateran Council. Of course, its sessions have been interrupted by Julius II, but continued on. He continued it once he received the papal tiara. The pragmatic sanction had been discussed in the preceding sessions and condemned by Julius II. Leo X desired that the question not be resumed because he was afraid of increasing the ill will of the French monarch, and he was hoping to effect some kind of a peaceful settlement, or he didn't want to concede to the sanction again, but he did want to bring about some kind of a peaceful settlement, so he chose not to reopen that particular question. His end was identical with that of Julius II. He always wanted to get rid of it, but he sought to reach that by different means, that end by different means. And he was naturally, our author says, of a mild and peaceable disposition. And he proved this in the following way. Whether it was good or not, we'll see, but he proved it in the following way. He reconciled two of those cardinals who had taken a leading part in the proceedings of the Council of Pisa. So two of those cardinals who had essentially convoked a schismatic council, he reconciled them. Whereas Julius II had said about them on his deathbed that as a Christian I forgive them, but as head of the universal church I think that justice should have its course. So he was not of a mindset to be reconciled with them, leaving them with any sort of dignities. But on learning the promotion of Leo, so he must have had this reputation already, these two culprits felt that it was a good time to seek forgiveness. So they came to Rome under the protection of a safe conduct, which was issued by Leo. They appeared before the council without any of the emblems of their rank. They were stripped of all the emblems of their rank. They prostrated themselves before the successor of the pontiff, whom they had, of course, injured, offended so terribly, by provoking a schismatic council. They remained like that for a short time, and then after that, one of these cardinals stood up and addressed the Pope, begging him to pity our fault, forgive our tears and penance. To which the Pope replied that the Church is a tender mother and receives with open arms all who return to her, and that she would not, by a weak indulgence, encourage the sinner to fall again, but still, he was determined to inflict a punishment on them. Then he says his punishment, as he put it, was to make them sign a declaration disavowing their proceedings against Julius II. And that seems to have been about it. I mean, you do something like that, you should be stripped of the cardinal and reduced to the lay state. If you call a schismatic council. But he reconciled them, and it seems he allowed them to continue on with their dignity. He restored them to their dignity. They resumed their former positions, and so that was Leo X. That was his personality. Perhaps a little too indulgent. The council carried on its work under the direction of the Pope. Rome had long needed, he says, a sacerdotal reform. And we'll see later on even during the reign of Leo X, Martin Luther visiting Rome and being scandalized by what he saw. It's not to say that his reaction to it was justified, but there were truly defects that were present among the Roman clergy. The Lateran Council, as being obedient to the wish of the sovereign pontiff, appointed a commission which was charged to determine the means, not only of reforming the morals of the clergy, but of bringing them back to the purity of the early ages of the church. So we still have, of course, shortcomings, but there are efforts to rectify things. The ordinances published for this end had good ideas. No candidate shall be raised to the priesthood who is not of a mature age, of exemplary conduct, and well versed in the learning of the schools. That theology, the mistress of learning, has been too much neglected. Henceforth, no one shall be admitted to the ministry of the altar without having made a serious study of the fathers and the canons. But theological learning is not alone sufficient for a priest. He must also display the virtues belonging to his divine calling. He must live into the constant practice of piety and chastity. His life must shine as a lamp before men, that God may be honored by his works. In proportion to the elevation of the dignity is the binding force of its obligations. The cardinals should be models of regularity and ecclesiastical perfection. Their abodes should be open to all men of worth and of learning, to indigent nobles, and to every person of virtuous life. The table of a prelate should be simple, frugal, and his house should be neither ruled by luxury nor by his avarice. And it goes on, other things that really you think would be common sense among prelates, but not necessarily. Apparently were not. You wouldn't have had a general council of the church putting down these ordinances had there not been offenses to the contrary. So now we go back to the humanists a bit here. The exclusive study of Latin and Greek authors with the predominance of Platonism fostered the revival of letters, so studying of literature, and had introduced into the learned world, the world of the academics, and even among theologians, a pagan error on the nature of the soul. The humanists of the day held that the soul of the world, one and universal, gave life to all beings, and was the same for all men, transforming itself in each individual and undergoing the modifications inherent in different natures. So, yes, these are Platonism. Of course, this easily gets into the realm of pantheism. Besides this general soul, common to all, they admitted the existence of another. So it's not just one, there are two. They called it the intellective, which, according to their theory, was mortal and perished with the body. A special decree was promulgated by the council condemning these errors. As you would hope. The decree of the council may have been provoked by certain works from the pen of Peter Pomponatius, who is a doctor of Mantua. In his treatise on the immortality of the soul, the author asserts that unaided reason would tend to reject that dogma, and that we can tend to reject dogma, and that we can know it only by revelation. The dogma on the immortality of the soul. It seems, as this author says, it seems to us, on the contrary, that reason rather leads us to admit to the immortality of the soul. And if you have questions about that, refer to your psychology notes. If you haven't studied that yet, you'll see it. But that's getting a bit outside of our scope here. So, as Pompontianus submitted his work to the tribunal of the Inquisition and published it anew with the corrections pointed out by the examiners. So he himself was, it seems, in good faith. Although how would you come up with that error? I don't know exactly, but he expunged those errors from his works. During the sessions of the Lateran Council, political events had followed in the course of time and called for the pontiff's attention. So Louis XII, who had been made wiser by certain reverses, had consented to make peace with the court of Rome. His ambassadors came to the council, and Leo received his advances with a willingness to be reconciled with him. as you would expect from the way he treated the cardinals earlier, and ended up absolving Louis from the censures which Julius II had pronounced against him. So there are some positive things going on here. Italy is at the time free from outside political pressure, which was a plus for him, politically anyway. And the Turks had been driven back by the arms of Hungary and Poland. Although Louis XII left no male heir to the crown, so it passed to his to the great grandson of the Duke of Orleans, the brother of Charles VI, to Francis I, King Francis I of France. So easy name to remember for a French king. This question of the pragmatic sanctions had, under various forms, continually occupied the attention of the Roman and French courts. Louis XII, in his disputes with Julius II, had made it an occasion of displaying his resentment against the Pope by giving force to its hostile prescriptions. You may remember that Louis XI put on a show of retracting it, doing away with it, but no, even so, it wasn't sincere, but he did put on a show of it. Louis XII is still enforcing it. In the Lateran Council, Julius had resorted to laying the French kingdom under interdict. So no mass, no sacraments in the entire kingdom of France on account of this. Francis held a different position with regard to Leo X. He says that they had an interview at the city of Bologna, so they talked to each other. Both sovereigns held the same view concerning the necessity of annulling the decree, but the matter was one of too much importance to be settled within the few days they passed together. So still something to be dealt with, although at least they agree that it's a problem and it needs to be done away with. When they separated, the Pope left two cardinals and the king as chancellor with full powers to conclude, by a Concordat, an amicable settlement of the difficulties which had so long divided the Church with the Kingdom of France. The negotiations between the cardinals and the chancellor lasted until the 18th of August, 1517, when the agreement known as the Concordat of Leo X was published with the approbation of the Holy See and continued to govern the Church of France until the Concordat of 1802. So, though it lasted for almost 300 years. So, we'll see later on if it was how good it was, but at least it lasted for a while. The fourth and 10th articles, by the fourth and 10th articles of this Concordat, cathedral and metropolitan churches were deprived of the right of election. So they used to be able to elect their canons and their bishops. They weren't allowed to do that anymore. Says that within 6 months after the vacancy of any charge, the king shall name a doctor or a licentiate in theology or law, possessing all the necessary qualifications, the choice to be confirmed by the Pope. So the arrangement now being someone will be nominated by the king and confirmed by the Pope. In speaking of the speaking of the pragmatic sanction, the Pope remarked that it gave up the Church of France to intrigue, violence, and simony, though that probably belongs in the section on the council itself. Although yes, of course, it gave rise to those problems, but that belongs in an earlier section. Let's see. Okay, so then back to the some of the famous art of the period, which is good to know. Again, if I can manage it, I'll try to print out some samples of the works of these artists. It's something that we should know because a lot of this art is very famous churches in Rome, something we should be familiar with. So we had the artists Michelangelo and Raphael, who were working at this time. Also Buonarroti, who was a sculptor, painter, and architect. And we won't go too much into all of this, but essentially they were very busy at this time. So all the famous works that you can think of that they made, they were busy with those around this time. So back to the Concordat, it was read in the Lateran Council before being made public, before being promulgated. The last act of the Fathers was the formal approval of the agreement. On the 16th of March, 1517, Leo X presided at the last session, which numbered 110 prelates. The questions which had occasioned their convocation were finally resolved. So there was certain peace among the princes of Christendom. Reform was effected in the morals and in the Roman court. At least in theory, the principles laid down for one. Although we'll see when Martin Luther comes to Rome that there's still problems. The schism and the false Council of Pisa were abolished, and the pragmatic sanction was annulled. So the Fourth Lateran Council, yes.
Sorry, Father. Oh,
This is still the Fourth Lateran Council, yes. That was part of its proceedings. And so, of course, then Leo confirmed all the acts of the preceding sessions and prescribed the collection of tithes, exhorted all beneficiaries to allow this collection on their benefits to be used in the war against the Turks. So they're still thinking about raising arms to fight off the Muslims. And of course, the Te Deum was chanted in Thanksgiving, which, as I recall, was something of a theme on last year's exam. And the Lateran Council, which had lasted 5 years, almost 5 years, was finally at an end. So it did quite a few things, actually. So again, there were a lot of political concerns that occupied Leo X's time and attention, but he gave some concern to literature, science, and art, and being he was very much a patron of all those things. Being part of the Medici family, a noble, wealthy family, it's natural that he would do that. Then also in the arena of theology, there was at the Roman court Cardinal Cajetan, who was devoted to St. Thomas Aquinas, and it's just a note on that. He wrote a treatise on the authority of the Pope and of the Council, in which he defended the monarchical supremacy of the sovereign pontiff, in which you see it would still be something that would have needed to be written at that time. Conciliarism was clearly still in the air. But then there was a case of actually attempted assassination against Leo X. For one thing, he had entrusted the government of Siena to the Bishop of Grosseto, and then there was a certain Cardinal Alfonso Petrucci, who was of the Borghese family, again another family from whom popes will come. Haven't seen them yet, we will. Whose ancestors held sovereign authority in Siena. They were naturally fiery disposition and excessively intemperate, so he started breaking out into complaints against the Pope and spoke openly of assassination. So he made it clear that he wanted to do away with Leo X for political motives. Then they hired a surgeon who was supposed to, I guess during a surgery or something, supposed to poison Leo X. It didn't work out, but they wanted to do it. And again, there were cardinals involved in this again, or at least who were implicated. And he was a little harder on these cardinals. But again, if you want to read more about this, they're in the different authors talk about them. But now we move on to one of the main events of Leo X, which was, of course, the rise of Martin Luther. So, interesting to consider the voice of a single monk. That Germany was, of course, shaken to its very center. The ignorant and ignoble were misled by a cry of liberty. Princes and nobles by the hope of throwing off the authority of the bishops and clergy, and relaxed religious who were hoping to escape the obligation which had become a burden to them. All of these people, all these different people from all classes of society, flocked to Martin Luther's standard, which was, of course, a standard of revolt, and they thought of him as some kind of a liberator. Although Luther himself would reportedly remark at a certain point that things were better before all this started. So he was not under any illusions that he himself had improved things, but that's how they saw him. Again, he may have been a very fiery and stirred people up and got his revolution going, but he wasn't. It wasn't only on him. There were plenty of other things we talked about before, lots of other circumstances that made it possible. And so now we'll look at some of those. It was a combination of many influences, springing from the elements of which German imperial society was then composed. The imperial power was as much concerned as the pontifical in silencing the rebellious monk, but it lacked the necessary means. The power of the German emperors was neither as extensive nor as firmly established at that time. The Holy Roman Emperor had some sway, some power, but not enough to deal with Martin Luther. The subordinate princes, again, remember the Holy Roman Empire was very much a confederation of all these other German states. They recognized the imperial authority, but they also could appeal to a judgment to a council of their peers. So the emperor was there, but wasn't like one of the old Roman emperors. The nobles formed a prominent part of the state, and they lived by spoliation. So you can see why throwing off the authority of the church and stealing all the church property would have been something attractive to them. Move on. So he really availed himself of the passions and the cupidity of the masses that he was dealing with. Of course, he claimed to be, under the name of reform, claimed to be a restorer of some kind of a pure morality, but obviously he himself didn't follow any sort of standards of morality. He authorized license, by his writings and his example, he authorized a license for people to revolt, and of course to every sort of vice. The Reformation, to which he attached his name, was also not only a religious, also a political revolution. So at his entrance on the scene of action, he found the elements of this twofold movement, which was to shake the world already prepared. So he came onto the scene, which was already was already ripe for revolution. The germ of Protestantism already existed before he came to foster it with his passionate language, which was either biting or insinuating, polished or rude, harmonious or insulting, eloquent or vulgar, depending on whatever situation he was in. He could be very fawning to the princes who were nice to him, but he could, of course, come out with every type of invective against the church, against the pope, against the bishops, etc. Anybody who stood in his way. So, of course, there had been other heretics who fomented revolution, even civil revolution, before he came along, but they didn't have the same support from the civil princes, so they didn't have the same resources as, say, John Huss had. Even he had some support from some civil princes, but not what Luther got. So now backing up, looking a little at Martin Luther before he came onto the scene as a revolutionary. He was born in 1483 of a poor family in Eisleben, so he was not a noble, as you would imagine from the fact that he became a monk. He was as a boy he was adventurous and often had to struggle against adversity and want as a child. And it was not a very pleasant childhood. There are stories of his parents being very, very severe against him, mistreating him in various ways. So he wasn't what you would call a very happy childhood by the accounts of his biographers. And there was but he did while he was studying as a child, as a student. There was a lady, a benefactor, who paid for his studies, so his family couldn't afford to pay for his studies. And then some of the things he studied in his education, he studied Cicero, Virgil, Livy, so he was getting into the humanism of the time, and that had some influence on him. And of course, there's a famous story of his friend being struck down by lightning next to him, causing him to vow to Saint Anne that if he were to be saved, he would become a monk. You'll see the people dispute that, but that's the most commonly told story. And so, as a result of that, he entered the Augustinian order and was ordained rather quickly. was within a year or two. But he was allowed to pronounce his vows and was ordained very quickly. And as we can see from things that happened later on, he should not have been. So he said when he was ordained, he wrote to one of his friends, he said, "Today I say my first Mass, come and hear it. Unworthy sinner as I am, God has been pleased to choose me in the abundance of his mercy. I shall strive to make myself worthy of his goodness, and insofar as it is possible for such a vile mass of dust to fulfill his designs. Pray that my holocaust may be pleasing in his sight." Now, from some people that might be taken as something edifying that you would say, but from him it had other motives. So we'll see it later, but that's not as edifying as it might have seemed originally. So he was, again, as I mentioned earlier, he was eventually sent to Rome. And the reason for that was there was essentially politics going on in the Augustinian order. Strict some houses that wanted to observe the rule of Saint Augustine more strictly than others. Saw one of the higher authorities in the order, whose name was Staupitz, wanted to bring them under his jurisdiction, and so Luther was sent to Rome for to further the cause of those monasteries that wanted to remain independent of the superior. So he went to Rome for that purpose, and so when he got there, he was, our author says, much less impressed by the Rome of the saints than by the corruption then rampant in ecclesiastical circles. So he first came into the sight of Rome. He did what was, as most pilgrims were, he was very happy to see the city, but then he became scandalized at what he saw afterwards. This our author, and actually this is what I'm taking from now, is from one of his biographers, Grisar. We started having this particular book read at table a few years ago, before we stopped in favor of the biography of St. Alphonsus, which was somewhat more edifying than Life of Martin Luther. Just a little. But this is taken from that author. He's a very thorough, so it takes a long time to go through it and determine all the things to talk about. But he gives everything, pretty much everything you need to know. And this is the English translation. It was originally in German. The English translation is abridged, and even that is very detailed. So I have to go through it. So again, he came to Rome during the reign of Julius II. So it was before there had even been any attempts to rectify things by the Fourth Lateran Council. Said that it was this author, Grisar, says that the capital of Christendom, under the influence of the frivolity which had seized the occupants of the papal throne and invaded the ranks of the higher clergy, had proved false to her dignity and forgetful of the fact that the eyes of the faithful who visited Rome from every quarter of the globe were jealously fixed upon her in their anxiety lest the godless spirit of the world should poison the very heart of the church. So essentially, this author is conceding that there was reason for him to be scandalized, that it wasn't purely pharisaical. Said, but at the same time, instead of being edified, by the good things which he did see there, he was much more strongly impressed by all of the problems that he saw. So. So he said that things not that he himself said, but things that he heard said were somebody said in his presence that if there be a hell, then Rome is built over it. Coming from this, that's coming from him. He repeated that. He didn't say I said that when I was there. He's said to have repeated it, probably an exaggeration, but it goes to show what he thought of his experiences when he was there. Saying shocking things like that. And there were more shocking things that he said about his visit in Rome. We'll see those next time. I'm about out of time here, but he didn't like it at all. And of course, he used all these things that he saw, whether they were true or not. He used these stories as as weapons against the church later on in his attacks. Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen, sub tuum presidium confugimus sancta Dei genitrix nostras deprecationes et dispicias in necessitatibus et a periculis conquis libera nos semper, Virgo gloriosa et benedicta.
Amen.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen.